A lot changes in 5 years. I mean, just think back to 2019 from now if you want any proof of that. And well, the 5 years between 1967 and 1972 saw a lot of change for Doctor Who. The Daleks had disappeared from the show, and it evolved as a result. First into the form it took for the last few years of the 60s, and then more dramatically, into the Earthbound unit family show that the Pertwee era began with. The show was now in colour, with more of an action hero Doctor, familiar characters surrounding the show, and a closer focus on ideas such as politics and modern day issues. The original Earthbound idea of a more adult science fiction series had mostly been confined to Season 7, with more traditional Doctor Who adventures beginning to come back in Season 8. While the monsters in Season 7 have been morally ambiguous and complex like the Silurians, in Season 8 you had pure baddies like the Axons and Azal, and of course the Master who dominated the proceedings. From year to year the show was evolving, and going into Season 9 it was clear that would continue as it became exceedingly obvious that the production team were beginning to get a bit bored with the concept they'd been settled with. It had turned out most of the ideas for Earthbound stories quickly got used, and things were in danger of becoming repetitive. The injection of the Master to freshen things up quickly got stale as well as he became overused. And well, one only needs to look at the stories of Season 9 to see the extent that this ended up being the case. This story involved time travel and facing the Daleks in the future Earth. The Curse of Peladon involved the mission for the Time Lords involving taking the Doctor to another planet in time, exactly the same for the mutants, and the Time Monitor involved shenanigans in time and space with the Master, which involved going places in the TARDIS. Only the Sea Devils actually retained the Earthbound format, and that was only really a reworking of Doctor Who and the Silurians rather than anything truly new. It was clear the production team basically felt this premise had run its course, and it's no wonder the Doctor's exile was promptly lifted at the start of the next season. It was unsurprising, therefore, that with a return to more traditional Who adventures, that the return of the Daleks was an attractive proposition. As for the Daleks themselves, they had not exactly been busy. Terry Nation's attempt to sell the Dalek series to America had been the impetus behind the evil of the Daleks writing them out, but that had petered out pretty quickly, and how viable a prospect it ever was is up to debate. After that, they just sort of sat dormant, neither their creator nor the production team of their parent show having any real interest in using them. The decision to bring them back to Doctor Who was a pretty simple one. Bit of publicity and excitement that the Daleks always managed to generate, and, well, Bob's your uncle. And, hey, it worked, got them on the front cover of the Radio Times and all the other things that were very exciting back in the 70s. The problem with this was it was decided at a fairly late stage, opinions differ on exactly when, to actually bring back the Daleks. It was definitely late enough that it was not actually possible to, write a Dalek story for the Daleks to appear in. So a story already in line to be produced for the season was going to have to be adapted for use for the Daleks. Louis Marks' story about time-travelling gorillas was the only one that they fit into, and so that's how Day of the Daleks was created. Despite this, Day of the Daleks is not at all a bad story. You'd think trying to fit in the Daleks where they absolutely don't fit would produce a disaster, but no, it's fairly serviceable, and even the Daleks, while not a hugely impressive element of the story even from a scripting standpoint, do get a few moments to shine. It's a flawed story, but ultimately the good I think outweighs the bad, and it's enjoyable to watch. It's fine. In fact, I'm going to do something I'm probably never going to do again. I'll tell you right now, as we start, I'm giving this story a final score of 5 out of 10. It's pretty much bang average for Classic Who. Some good ideas, a nice bit of complexity and depth to go with a fairly well-rounded story that is ultimately an enjoyable watch. But there are some missteps, a lot of the ideas and characters are just underdeveloped, and ultimately it's held back by that. And that is, I think, the problem. It's just a very pedestrian story, one that almost feels by the numbers at points, like it's Doctor Who there to fill out the time slot. As a story it's fine, it's not bad by any means, but it's the kind of anticlimax as the grand return of the Daleks you'd never get away with nowadays. Anyway, we'll start as we always do with the production, and we'll straight away begin with the most notorious element of it, the Daleks themselves. See, combined with a relatively short notice of the decision to use the Daleks and the fact they hadn't appeared for half a decade, it meant that they were a tad out of practice with using them, and this led to a fairly underwhelming appearance for the Pepperpots. Firstly, they were only able to get together the parts to put together 3 Daleks, and even then they looked pretty tatty. I've never been a huge fan of the dark grey look they went for in the 70s and 80s. I think it does lack the elegance of the 60s like grey and blue, and it contributes to them looking tired and dated here, even though this was their first appearance in years. The number of Daleks proved to be an impediment to the final battle, which, while nowhere near as bad as some people make out, honestly I think is much worse than you'd expect for Doctor Who's budget, and we'll kind of get to that later. Yeah, it's underwhelming. And then there's the voices, which are sort of just as bad as everyone says.
Whoever is operating the time machine is an enemy of the Daleks.
Yeah, why on earth they didn't just bring back some of the 60s era voice actors, as indeed they would with Roy Skelton from the next story onwards, that's kind of beyond me, and the results are poor. The voice of the Daleks is one of their most important features, and getting it right is so important to their menace. Imagine if in the first scene in the first Dalek story they sounded like that. Would they have made the same impression? Ultimately, this failure of presentation, combined with how obviously they are a late addition to the script, makes a return of the Daleks feel pretty pointless and cheap, honestly. Like they were off the screen for 5 years after their final end in Evil, only to come back sounding and looking like that. Well, it's not exactly impressive. The deficiencies in their presentation in the script could have been partially made up for with some menace in their performance. I mean, imagine some of the stuff when they're up against the controller with the voices from Power and Evil, and how much more weight it would have held, but no, it's like that, and well, it doesn't work. The story itself is not bad, but the Daleks are portrayed so poorly, and their inclusion so obviously not natural, that I think this is a bad return for the Daleks. As we'll see, a recurring element of Dalek stories throughout the 70s and 80s was not knowing how to use them, and, well, they certainly didn't know how to get them right here. Now, no doubt some of you are watching this going, but there's a special edition on the DVD that fixes these issues, to which I have two answers. One, doesn't matter, I'm here to review the version as originally broadcast, which is why I didn't rewatch the animations for Power and Evil. And two, more importantly, I think it should be borne in mind that the special edition is still done on a low budget without that many resources. Yeah, it adds some more visual effects, but I don't think they look great. Now, don't misunderstand me, I completely understand why they don't look great, their resources were extremely limited, but frankly I don't think sort of the After Effects style stuff really does work any better than that was originally done back in the original story. And yes, I know they changed the voices, but I don't know, Nicholas Briggs' style of Dalek voice, it works very well in New Who with the way the Daleks are presented, but I don't know, I just don't think it fits the classic Daleks, and I don't think it sort of gels well with the original dialogue surrounding them as well. It just sounds off. Better than the original, sure, but then what wouldn't be? Ultimately, I just don't think it fits. So, yeah, special edition just doesn't really do it for me. And, well, I wouldn't want to review it anyway, because it's not what the story is originally broadcast. So, yeah. As for the rest of the production, personally I feel that it's actually pretty lackluster and a major drag on the story. Now, to be fair, I think part of it is that they set their sights a little too high for their budget. The portrayal of a post-apocalyptic Earth that looks like it was shot on a council estate is not exactly stellar. But, I mean, well, it's difficult to see what else they could have done without complex models and more extensive location work that probably wasn't affordable. And the full frontal attack on the house by the Daleks and the Ogrons I'm not sure would have looked all that great even with a few more Daleks. Again, because the show simply didn't have the budget at the time to pull that off. But also, there's a lot of bad decisions that simply drag it down. The director for this was Paul Bernard, whose Who resume extends to a few Pertwee stories and nothing else, and I don't think his job here was great. For a start, there are a few just really quite bizarre decisions in the way it's put together that frankly come across as sloppiness if nothing else. For instance, in the cliffhanger reprises, when the moment where the sting came in at the end of the previous episode, the sting comes in again, except it's obviously not leading into the end credits, so it just sort of stops, and it sounds beyond bizarre. There are also some editing decisions that drag it down, quite a few fades that just seem very out of place and kill the momentum of scenes. And the first appearance of a Dalek in the story is pretty weird.
Report!
Bear in mind, the only clue the Daleks were even in this was the "of the Daleks" in the title, which admittedly was a pretty big clue, but even so, the first appearance of them after so long should have been more than just a tiny glance that feels so pedestrian and unimpressive. While the voices wouldn't have helped, the end of episode 1 would have done fine as a reveal and had the traditional monster cliffhanger even though they're in the name of the story, which, is a tradition, so it works fine. Now, obviously this moment would have been in the script, so it's not entirely Bernard's fault, but if it had had the moment, it should have been handled far better than that. It should have been like a slow and menacing reveal which focused on the controller to show his feelings towards his masters. But yeah, just suddenly flashing like that as if it's a, "Ooh, look at this, there's the Dalek here!" "Oh, no, there isn't." Yeah, not great. Ultimately, though, I think the biggest problem with its directing is it just feels kind of flat and uninspired, which, it kind of seems for the whole story, doesn't it? Most of the action is pretty tepid. I mean, yeah, they weren't going to be able to realise the final battle, but even with the budget, even with the limited Daleks, the Daleks and the Ogrons slowly moving towards the camera was probably not the best way to try and highlight how exciting and intense it was. The Dalek scenes also don't really work for me as shot. The confrontations between the Doctor and the Controller are entirely the script and the actors. The camera does nothing to enhance the tension, just feels so back and forth. It's difficult to entirely place my finger on it in some places, but it definitely just feels very lackluster. The director didn't have much experience with the show, and wasn't really able to realise it on screen, and yeah, it sounds about right. As for anything else, this story is historically significant as the earliest story to exist in its entirety on its original broadcast videotapes. So, that's interesting, isn't it? Anyway, that's all I really have to say about the production aspects. Not great, pretty lackluster. The script is where things get a bit more interesting, and it's where the good and the bad sort of become a bit more obvious, and where the odd genesis of the story kind of shows up a bit more. I'll start by looking at the Daleks themselves and how they obviously do not fit in this story. Now, I'm not sure if it's ever been revealed what writer Louis Marks' original intentions were for this story, as while the Daleks do feel shoehorned in, as we'll get to momentarily, you would need something in their place to have taken over the world as they have in the story, and I'm not sure what would have taken its place. Maybe sort of some kind of human dictatorship rather than alien invasion. Might have added some scope for exploring that, but conversely you'd have lost much of the character stuff from the controller with the whole being a collaborator, so take it or leave it. But honestly, it's probably one of those things that's not really answerable from the information we know. The Daleks do feel like they don't really belong here, though. And the reason for that is ultimately they don't actually do that much in this story. Throughout most of it, they just sit in their base, bark orders at the controller, act all Dalek about things, and then at the end they sort of bugger off into the 20th century to fight unit soldiers with pretty primitive weapons to a draw. The manipulative, menacing scheming of power, the feeling of being unstoppable rulers, and the fact that our heroes were fighting a hopeless battle from the Dalek invasion of Earth, or, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the ruthless, persistent pursuers of the chase, none of it is here. They just feel like we go from a completely unrelated story to the Daleks essentially giving running commentary of what's going on. The structure of the story where there was something else in their place is only too clear, and it hampers their portrayal. The production difficulties made them less effective, sure, but even without that they wouldn't be particularly great because, as I said, they don't do anything. It's all bark and no bite. No sign like we got in Power of how intelligent and powerful they really were. Just, we're the big baddies here, oh no, we've been defeated, the end. It's just disappointing after an extended absence to see them essentially be thrown in to be the Daleks. Just sit there and say, we are the Daleks, exterminate, and not actually really do anything. There is one area I think Marks did try to explore the Daleks, and that's through their interactions with the controller. I do like this character a lot, and I'll get to why separately in a moment, but the way he interacts with the Daleks works really well, I think. It shows the difference between the human mind and the Dalek mind in a rather interesting and revealing way. The controller is shown to be an effective thinker, one who has a human way of seeing things. He's pragmatic, open, and able to work to realistic boundaries and ideas. Whereas the Daleks just want him to obey and never question and make everything work, which is a way of showing a flaw in the Daleks' approach to things. What's even the point of having the controller if you're just going to tell him to do something a Robo-Man from the Dalek invasion of Earth could? The rigidness of their approach, in the end, does more harm than good, because it means that threats are only dealt with through brute force and iron fist. And that's clearly led to mass resistance, and in the end turns their most important human ally against them. Now, they obviously just kill him, but it means it gives their mortal enemy the chance he needs to go and help history be changed and prevent their conquest from ever happening. I think if there was going to be a way to quickly insert an interesting look at the Daleks into the story, this was the way to do it. It's not much, but I think it's a nice subtle way of giving the Pepperpots at least something to separate them from any old generic villain in this story. Anyway, speaking of the Controller is the story's most effective character. He appears initially as the willing servant of the Daleks, but we quickly see there are shades to him. He occasionally lets the mask slip that he does care about the humans the Daleks lord over, but we're also allowed to question whether it's genuine concern driving it that leads him to support the Daleks in order to prevent further suffering, as he says, or if it's just a lie he tells himself and he's really just looking out for himself. Later on in the story, he's confronted by the Doctor directly about it, the latter not holding back any accusations and his contempt for the Controller, and it's clear that every word the Doctor is saying is hitting hard at him, and his struggle to justify it is the key to his character's eventual fate. We also see, however, that he's also an extremely clever and resourceful man, able to manipulate Jo so effortlessly as he does. While Jo is clearly playing up the damsel angle as she's clocked is what's keeping her alive at that moment, the way he suckers her in really shows how he managed to survive so long, that his smooth talking and manipulations have managed to keep him in high state with the Daleks despite everything. Ultimately, though, he does turn against the Daleks, but again it's allowed to be open to interpretation whether that's his conscience finally breaking free, or whether it's simply another calculation. But the Doctor is right, and this can lead to the defeat of the Daleks, and one's wish to see the Daleks gone is not in doubt, whether that's self-interest or something else, again, left for interpretation, and that's good. His death scene is probably, I think, the best scene in the story. After letting the Doctor escape, he attempts to manipulate his way out, but he was betrayed, and the Daleks hear none of it and just say they're going to exterminate him. He therefore uses his final words to give them the middle finger.
Who knows? I may have helped to exterminate you.
It's a fitting end for the character, one whose allegiance was always, for reasons open to interpretation, to humanity as a whole, and whose actions allowed humanity to defeat the Daleks after all. And also quickly, it's a good bit that is good for the Daleks as well. They replace him as controller with the guy who betrayed him, who's just a pretty standard guard thug, who'll just be a yes man for them or achieve nothing, perhaps a sign of why they end up being defeated shortly afterwards. The controller is played brilliantly by Aubrey Woods, Fun fact, he's the guy who played the candy store owner in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the Candy Man can. And his interactions with Pertwee are brilliant as both actors rise to the challenge and bring a real intensity to it. The third Doctor's certainty and his moral convictions meant he could argue with such certainty, and Wood's ability to portray the controllers fight back with the right intensity, but with the sign that he might not really believe it. I think that's really, really well done. This character is easily the strongest part of the story in my eyes. As for other good parts of it, I like the Ogrons. They're a solid concept and a great make-up job that makes a memorable monster. I'm surprised New Who hasn't brought back yet. They also play in sort of stuff with the Daleks, how they prefer the stupid and ineffective Ogrons because they'll just do what they're told, while the Controller prefers the human guards who might, be useful but might talk back a little bit while they do it. But yeah, they play a small but fun role in the story. I'd say the third Doctor is on great form here, and he's definitely the right Doctor for this kind of story. His bold, confident, uncompromising drive, it allows him to be an effective focal point for this story. His interactions with the other groups allows him, for instance, to be both the defiant prisoner and the sort of moral guardian to the guerrillas. Allows him to be sort of the conscience for the Controller, and, well, to the Daleks, he's just a Doctor, and that works very well as well. Pertwee also gives a great performance. While in his later two Dalek stories he just seems bored, here he at least does give his usual energy and drive. It helps he has few interactions with the Daleks themselves, and it focuses instead on his chemistry of Woods as the Controller. The rest of the regulars don't have too much to do, but Manning, Courtney and the rest all give fine performances. One of the best parts of the story, in fact, is the time travel stuff, which, while hardly breaking any moulds with its complexity, does nevertheless give a solid mystery and a great payoff for the revelation that the guerrillas caused the very war they're trying to stop, and the time loop it's setting up does work logically without any real hiccups. It's an intelligent basis for the story, and Marks works with it pretty well. This plays into another thing I like about the story that is paced pretty well. The building up of the mysteries work exactly as they should. They're answered before long, but it brings up new ones as they go. We go from Who Were the Ghost style store, right through all the other mysteries, right up to, oh, and you blow up the worlds yourselves, you silly billies, over the course of the 4 episodes, and it works really well in keeping the viewer's interest. As for what doesn't work, well, I've already talked about the Daleks and how they don't fit in the story that well, so I won't repeat myself. But I will say that the biggest problem I have with the story is how pedestrian and safe it feels, how little energy so much of it has, and a really menacing and cunning Dalek threat could have really added to what was needed there, but alas, it wasn't to be. The problem is that while the elements are there to make it work, it just feels like it's going through the motions a lot of the time, and isn't willing to go beyond the surface level. This can be summed up by episode 1, where we have pretty much the standard Pertwee era playbook. Generic international politics, which gets interrupted by something sci-fi, which gets Unit called in, the Doctor trying to fix his TARDIS, and then the Brigadier turns up to tell him about it, then he acts all superior, the Doctor then turns up and argues with a petty bureaucrat, we get shenanigans with Yates acting like an arsehole and Benton acting all confused, etc. and so forth. Nothing feels like it's particularly new or interesting. For instance, the stakes of this are the entire world. We're supposed to get the impression from the way the geopolitics stuff is being set up that the fate of, well, the entire future of the world is in the balance here, and you just don't get that from what's being portrayed. The generic nature of it all doesn't help, of course, a particularly funny bit being all the national stereotypes turning up as the diplomats at the end. But the weight to it just isn't there. We're just being told this is the case and not really feeling it at all. The importance of these talks and of styles, it needed to be played up far more to have the right impact. It just also plays it safe though, and it just keeps it as a bit dull and in the background, and that's about it. Equally with the unit stuff, we feel like we're just going through the motions really. The Brigadier does nothing of note at all of the story apart from turn up and save the Doctor a few times, while the Doctor acts all smug and the Brigadier acts all bewildered. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. No dimensions to it, nothing new. Just feels like this is the Pertwee era, this is what we do. Never is this clearer in the presentation of the guerrillas, who should be one of the story's driving forces. They're the ones who set the events in motion, and they're the ones who drive the resolution. We should know all about them and be ready to connect with them, but we don't. They're all cutouts with no real personalities other than footnotes. He's the argumentative one, he's the reckless one, she's the bossy one. It gets tedious, frankly, following them around and learning nothing about their personalities and their goals or anything like that. And what we do get is crumbs, and cliché crumbs at that. Are you scared of the big base? Oh yes, and I'd be a fool if I wasn't. Yawn! It doesn't help we only see about 5 of them, which given this is supposed to be a huge part of the population, enough for the Daleks to consider them an extremely serious threat, and again shows part of the human spirit and all how that ties in with the controller stuff, but there's only enough of them to start up like a small band or something, assuming they have like a main guitarist and the rhythm guitarist. Could you seriously not afford some more extras for this? But the main point is that the connection the ending is supposed to be based on, the guerrillas realising their place in this time loop and breaking it, is not there because the characters just never become more than what their single line descriptions are. I mean, the gorilla who gets stuck in the past and ends up blowing it up, we know nothing about him or his personality, and he's just a blank cardboard cutout. He is man number one. It makes his sacrifice feel like nothing. He's a character we barely knew, and he's blowing up the Daleks, well, just because he happens to be there because the plot says he is. I don't feel anything for him, just, oh, that wraps that up and nothing else. Some character development here was just so sorely needed. The guy who blew it up, we needed to know about his motivations and his backstories to make his sacrifice effective, because he essentially says what he does, the whole "this time it's going to be different" thing, with no basis at all. We're just basing that on, he's a gorilla, so that's what he's going to be. It annoys me because so much of the dialogue early on in their story, when they've captured the Doctor and Joe, is just wasted on generic nothing instead of fleshing them out. Given how much the story was supposed to rely on these guys, it just doesn't work. Finally, speaking of the ending's not great. It feels like it sort of ran out of story at the end, as once we get the revelation about the time loop, everything just sort of wraps up very, very quickly. The Daleks start attacking, the guy blows up the house and them, and we get the Doctor going, oh right, that's all sorted then, and there we are, end credits. So we just sort of hope that the talks turned out okay, even though the house they were going to have them in just exploded. I mean, yeah, they weren't in it, they'd been evacuated, but surely that's going to raise some concerns. We were this close to getting blown up. Did the Brigadier have to go along and tell them all about the future gorillas? Did they take that for an answer? It feels rushed and it'll fall out. It also adds to the feeling that the Daleks don't fit in this story, that they're defeated far too easily by one explosion, conveniently with a bomb that will blow them up, of course, whereas the Daleks have rarely been beaten with so little effort before now. The Doctor isn't really even that important in their defeat. I mean, yeah, he turns up and tells Gorilla Man that he shouldn't kill Styles and then Shed should blow up the Daleks, but that's about it, really. I don't know, perhaps it was all just a sign of the production that had too little time, but ultimately I think these issues led to the pedestrian, been there, done that feeling of it. This story has some things to say, sure, but not enough to really grab the interest as it should. So as I said earlier, this is average Classic Who to a T. It's enjoyable to watch, has a few good characters, and has some stuff that will make you think. It's far from bad, and you won't hate watching it at all, but you might just find it a bit lacking. I'd say it's easily the best of the three main Pertwee era Dalek stories, simply because while it hasn't too much at all that's impressive, it avoids being actively bad in most cases as well. Even with the underdeveloped gorillas or the rushed ending, it's just lackluster rather than sort of actively terrible. In the history of the Daleks, this will never be anything except a footnote, an unremarkable story where they play little real role, which only has the asterisk about being their return after their hiatus, and their first colour appearance in Doctor Who, but otherwise, there's not really much to talk about here when it comes to them. But as I said, it's not bad. I'd actually recommend it, to be honest, just because of the character stuff that does work, and because, well, it's 4 episodes that won't waste your time. You might not come away feeling entirely fulfilled, but you'll at least be satisfied, and that probably counts for something. Anyway, the regular pattern continues in 2 weeks' time with another New Who episode, but there's also a special treat for you all on Thursday, which the astute ones among you might notice is Halloween. Yes, we have an extra episode, a Halloween special, one some of you might find particularly absorbing.